This is the story of John and Horace Dodge, two brothers who built one of America's greatest automotive empires from nothing, only to have it all collapse in tragedy. They were mechanics, innovators, and ruthless businessmen. They helped create Ford Motor Company, then became Henry Ford's biggest rivals. And in the span of just 11 months, both brothers would be dead, setting off a chain of family conflicts and corporate disasters that would ultimately destroy everything they had built. Along the way, we will encounter brilliant engineering, bitter feuds, lavish excess, sudden death, and one of the most dramatic corporate collapses of the early 20th century. So, let us begin. But first, who exactly were the Dodge brothers, and how did two poor kids from Michigan become automotive royalty? John Francis Dodge was born in 1864, and his younger brother Horace Elgin Dodge followed in 1868. They grew up in Niles, Michigan, in a family that knew hardship. Their father, Daniel Dodge, was a machinist who ran a small foundry, and from him the boys learned metalwork before they could properly read. By the time they were teenagers, both brothers were already skilled machinists, capable of building and repairing complex machinery with their hands. This would prove to be their greatest asset. The brothers were inseparable. I mention this because their bond was not just familial, but professional. Where one went, the other followed. They thought alike, worked alike, and even looked remarkably similar, though John was the taller and more outspoken of the two. Horace was quieter, more technically minded, but no less ambitious. Together, they formed a partnership that would last their entire lives. In the 1890s, the Dodge brothers moved to Detroit and opened a small machine shop. They made bicycles at first, which was the hot industry of the era. But they were smart enough to see that bicycles were not the future. Something new was coming, something that would change everything: the automobile. Now, in the early 1900s, Detroit was becoming the center of the American automotive industry, and dozens of entrepreneurs were scrambling to build horseless carriages. Most of them had grand visions, but no real mechanical expertise. The Dodge brothers had the opposite problem. They were master machinists who could build anything, but they lacked the capital to start their own car company. So they did something clever instead. In 1902, a man named Ransom Olds came to them with a contract. He needed engines for his Oldsmobile cars, and the Dodge brothers were the best machinists in Detroit. They accepted the contract and delivered. Their engines were precise, reliable, and exactly what Olds needed. Word spread. Soon, other automotive pioneers came calling. And that is when Henry Ford walked through their door. Ford was working on his third attempt at starting an automobile company, having failed twice already. He needed parts, good parts, reliable parts, and he needed someone who could manufacture them in quantity. The Dodge brothers agreed to supply Ford with engines, transmissions, and axles. But here is where it gets interesting. Ford had no money to pay them up front. So instead of cash, the brothers took stock in Ford Motor Company. This decision would make them millionaires, but it would also plant the seeds of a bitter rivalry. We will get to that later. For now, the Dodge brothers became Ford's most important suppliers. When the Model T launched in 1908 and became the best-selling car in America, it was largely running on Dodge-built components. The brothers were making a fortune, both from their supply contracts and from their Ford stock, which was paying extraordinary dividends. By 1913, they were among the wealthiest men in Detroit. But they were not satisfied. Here is the thing about John and Horace Dodge. They were not the type to be junior partners forever. They had watched Henry Ford build an empire using their parts, and they believed they could do just as well on their own, maybe better. After all, they were the ones who actually knew how to build things. Ford was a visionary, yes, but he was not a machinist. The Dodge brothers were. In 1913, they made their move. They informed Ford that they would no longer be supplying him with parts. Instead, they were going to build their own car. Ford was furious. He viewed it as a betrayal, and the relationship between Ford and the Dodges turned hostile almost overnight. But the brothers did not care. They had the money, the skills, and the ambition. In 1914, the first Dodge automobile rolled off the assembly line in their brand-new factory in Hamtramck, Michigan. It was an immediate success. The Dodge brothers had learned from Ford's mistakes and successes. Their car was sturdier than the Model T, with an all-steel body instead of wood. It had a more powerful engine. It was more comfortable, and while it cost more than a Ford, customers were willing to pay the premium. In its first year, Dodge Brothers Automobile Company sold more than 45,000 cars. By 1916, they were the fourth largest automaker in America. If you are enjoying this story, consider subscribing. It really helps us reach more people who love this kind of history. But anyway, back to the Dodge brothers. Their success was extraordinary, but it came with a price. The brothers worked constantly, driving themselves and their employees hard. John handled the business side while Horace focused on engineering and production. They built one of the most modern factories in the world with innovative assembly line techniques that rivaled Ford's own methods, and they were not afraid to spend money on quality. Every Dodge car was tested rigorously before it left the factory. The brothers believed that their reputation depended on reliability, and they were right. But their relationship with Henry Ford continued to deteriorate. Ford had begun withholding dividends from his minority shareholders, including the Dodges, claiming that he wanted to reinvest profits back into the company. The Dodge brothers suspected, probably correctly, that Ford was trying to squeeze them out. In 1916, they did something almost unheard of. They sued Henry Ford. The case went all the way to the Michigan Supreme Court, and the Dodge brothers won. Ford was ordered to pay out the withheld dividends. It was a huge victory, but it also deepened the animosity between them. Ford never forgave the Dodges, and he eventually bought out all his minority shareholders just to be rid of them. The Dodge brothers received roughly $25 million for their Ford stock. In today's money, that would be well over $300 million. They were now fabulously wealthy, and their car company was thriving. By 1920, Dodge Brothers was producing 140,000 cars per year. They had dealerships across the country and were expanding internationally. The future looked unlimited. And then disaster struck. In January 1920, John Dodge traveled to New York City to attend the National Automobile Show. While there, he contracted influenza. The Spanish flu pandemic was still claiming victims, and John fell seriously ill. He was rushed back to Detroit, but his condition worsened. On January 14, 1920, John Dodge died of pneumonia. He was 55 years old. Horace was devastated. Remember, these brothers had spent their entire lives together. They had built everything together. They had never been apart for more than a few days. When John died, something broke inside Horace. Friends and family said he was never the same afterward. He lost interest in the business. He lost interest in life. He developed his own health problems and seemed unable or unwilling to fight them. Less than 11 months after John's death on December 10, 1920, Horace Dodge died of cirrhosis of the liver. He was 52. In less than a year, both founders of Dodge Brothers Automobile Company were gone. And this is where the real tragedy begins. You see, John and Horace had built their company personally. Every major decision went through them. They had not groomed successors or established a clear line of leadership. When they died, they left behind a power vacuum, enormous fortunes, and families who were not equipped to run an automotive empire. John's widow, Matilda, inherited his share of the company. Horace's widow, Anna, inherited his. Neither woman had any experience in business or manufacturing. They relied on hired managers to run the company, but without the brothers' vision and drive, Dodge Brothers began to drift. The company was still profitable. The cars were still well made. But the innovative spirit that had driven the Dodge brothers was gone. The managers who replaced them were competent but cautious. They made incremental improvements rather than bold innovations. And in the rapidly evolving automobile industry of the 1920s, standing still was the same as falling behind. Meanwhile, the Dodge widows and their children began spending their inheritances with spectacular abandon. Matilda Dodge Wilson, John's widow, remarried and built one of the most extravagant estates in American history, called Meadow Brook Hall. It was a massive Tudor revival mansion with over 100 rooms, sprawling across hundreds of acres in Rochester, Michigan. The construction alone cost $4 million, which is equivalent to roughly $60 million today. She filled it with art, antiques, and every luxury imaginable. Anna Dodge, Horace's widow, was even more extravagant. She built Rose Terrace, a palatial estate in Grosse Pointe, that rivaled the mansions of European royalty. She traveled the world on her yacht, one of the largest private vessels ever built at the time. She threw parties that became legendary for their opulence. She collected jewels and art with seemingly no concern for cost. Now, I do not want to suggest there was anything wrong with wealthy people enjoying their money. But the point is that none of this wealth was being reinvested in Dodge Brothers Automobile Company. The families were living like royalty while their business slowly stagnated. By 1925, the family decided they did not want to be in the automobile business at all. They sold Dodge Brothers to a New York banking firm called Dillon, Read & Company for $146 million. It was one of the largest financial transactions in American history up to that point. The Dodge heirs walked away with generational wealth beyond imagination, but the company they sold had already begun its decline. Dillon, Read tried to modernize Dodge, but they were bankers, not car builders. They cut costs where the Dodge brothers would have invested in quality. They chased short-term profits instead of long-term innovation. The result was predictable. Dodge cars began to develop a reputation for being less reliable than they had been under the founders. In 1928, Dillon Read sold Dodge to Chrysler Corporation for $170 million. Walter Chrysler saw value in the Dodge name and dealer network, and he integrated the brand into his growing automotive empire. Dodge survived, but it was no longer an independent company. It was no longer the innovative powerhouse the brothers had built. It was just another brand in a conglomerate. And what of the Dodge heirs? Their stories are a mixture of tragedy and excess. John Dodge's children struggled with the weight of their inheritance. His son, John Duval Dodge, became known for his playboy lifestyle, his multiple marriages, and his troubled relationship with money. Despite inheriting millions, he frequently found himself in financial difficulties due to his extravagant spending. He died in 1942, having never accomplished anything comparable to what his father had built. Horace's son, Horace Jr., was similarly directionless. He enjoyed the privileges of wealth without its responsibilities. He collected cars, boats, and houses. He married multiple times. He lived comfortably but unremarkably. The drive that had made his father great was simply absent. The Dodge widows themselves lived long lives of extraordinary luxury. Matilda Dodge Wilson eventually donated Meadowbrook Hall and its grounds to Michigan State University, where it became a cultural landmark. Anna Dodge continued her lavish lifestyle until her death in 1970, having outlived both her husband and the company he built by 50 years. But here is what I find most striking about this whole story. The Dodge brothers built something real, something that mattered. They were not aristocrats or inheritors. They were working-class kids who learned a trade and mastered it. They saw an opportunity in a brand-new industry and seized it. They had the courage to break away from Henry Ford when they could have stayed comfortable as his suppliers forever. And they succeeded beyond what anyone could have reasonably predicted. But they did not plan for what would happen after they were gone. This is a pattern we see again and again in family businesses. The founders possess a unique combination of vision, drive, and expertise that simply cannot be passed down like property. You can inherit money, you can inherit stock, you cannot inherit genius. And the Dodge brothers, for all their brilliance in engineering and business, never solved the problem of succession. Some historians argue that their early deaths were simply bad luck. If John had not caught the flu, if Horace had taken better care of his health, perhaps they could have groomed successors or established structures that would have allowed the company to thrive without them. Maybe. But I am not so sure. The truth is that many founder-led companies struggle with succession, even when the founders live long lives. The personal qualities that make someone a great entrepreneur are rarely replicated in their children, who grow up in comfort rather than hardship, who inherit wealth rather than creating it. The Dodge children were not bad people. They were simply ordinary people who happened to be born into extraordinary circumstances. And the wealth itself became a kind of trap. When you inherit millions of dollars at a young age, what motivation do you have to work hard, to take risks, to build something of your own? The Dodge heirs could afford to live lives of leisure, so that is what they did. They built mansions instead of factories. They collected art instead of creating innovations. They spent their inheritance rather than growing it. This pattern repeats throughout American business history. The founders of great fortunes are usually driven, hardworking, and innovative. Their children are often comfortable and complacent. Their grandchildren frequently squander whatever remains. It is almost a law of nature. The Dodge brothers themselves seem to sense this on some level. Both John and Horace were known for their work ethic, their hands-on approach to business, and their disdain for lazy aristocrats. They built their fortune through skill and effort, not inheritance or luck. And yet they failed to instill these same values in the next generation. But maybe that was inevitable. How do you teach hunger to someone who has never been hungry? How do you instill drive in someone who has never needed to strive? The Dodge brothers came from a world where failure meant poverty, where hard work was not a virtue but a necessity. Their children came from a world of mansion and servants and bottomless bank accounts. These are simply different universes. There is another element to this story that deserves mention. The automobile industry in the 1920s was undergoing rapid consolidation. Small independent manufacturers were being squeezed out by larger competitors who could achieve economies of scale. Even if the Dodge brothers had lived, they might have eventually sold the company or merged with a larger firm. The economics of the industry were moving in that direction regardless of who was running any particular company. But I think the brothers would have gotten a better deal. I think they would have maintained the company's reputation for quality. I think they would have negotiated from a position of strength rather than weakness. Instead, their widow sold to the first reasonable offer, and the bankers who bought it treated the company as a financial asset rather than an industrial enterprise. And so the Dodge name survived, but the Dodge spirit did not. The company that exists today, as part of what is now Stellantis, bears little resemblance to what John and Horace built. Modern Dodges are fine cars, I suppose, but they are designed by committees and produced by corporations. They lack the personal touch, the obsessive attention to quality that characterized the original Dodge brothers' automobiles. We can only imagine what the brothers themselves would have thought of all this. John, with his fiery temper and business acumen, would probably have been appalled at how quickly their empire was dismantled. Horace, the quieter engineer, might have been more philosophical about it, but neither would have been happy to see their legacy reduced to a brand name owned by a multinational conglomerate. And what of the rivalry with Ford? Henry Ford outlived both Dodge brothers by nearly 3 decades, dying in 1947. His company survived the succession problem somewhat better, though Ford Motor also went through rocky periods when Henry's descendants took control. The Ford and Dodge competition continued long after the original competitors were gone, but it was never personal again. It could not be. The men who had made it personal were dead. Well, there we are. The Dodge brothers built one of the great American automotive fortunes through skill, hard work, and willingness to take risks. They died young, within months of each other, leaving behind a company without leadership and families without direction. Their heirs lived lives of spectacular luxury while their business slowly declined, was sold once, was sold again, and eventually became just another brand in someone else's portfolio. It is a story of success and failure, innovation and stagnation, creation and destruction. The brothers themselves were remarkable men who emerged from poverty to build something genuinely impressive. Their children and widows were ordinary people who happened to be extraordinarily wealthy. The contrast is striking, but it is also instructive. Building something great is hard. Preserving it is harder. And passing it on intact to the next generation may be the hardest thing of all. If you enjoyed this one, subscribe for more. And let me know in the comments where you are watching from. Take care, and I will see you in the next one.